Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I have made it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax.
Hello, listeners. My name is Cassie Hamer. I'm the guest host for this episode. I'm an author and a reading tragic. I'm also a big sports fan, like so many Australians. I love my cricket and my netball and footy, and I really love when my two worlds collide, when sports meets fiction. Add a dash of romance and comedy, and you have all the makings of a truly fabulous book, which is exactly what our guest for this episode has written. After the Siren is a queer sports rom-com by debut author Darcy Green, an enemies to lovers romance where the on-field action is more than matched by the off-field. Darcy, welcome to the podcast. What a book. I mean, two really hot main characters, terrific banter between them, some truly steamy, intimate scenes, but also plenty to say about the pressures and the expectations that we place on our sporting heroes. What's it been like to have your first book in the world?
It's been very exciting. I think it's a little bit of a strange time because on the one hand, it feels like all your dreams have come true and people keep saying that to you. And it is really joyful and exciting, but also there's the, I suppose, anxiety of having something that you care very deeply about out in the world and wondering what people will think of it. And you sort of lose control of the book once it's out, right? It's not really yours anymore. It belongs to the people who are reading it and what they get out of it. So I feel like it's been a really lovely 6 weeks or so, but also quite a strange 6 weeks.
Most authors agree that putting a book out there is quite a vulnerable spot to be in, and vulnerability is actually one of the core themes of your story as well. So let's talk in a bit more detail about what happens in the book. So we've got Theo and Jake, who are our main characters, and they're both professional AFL players with the Brunswick Falcons. Theo's new to the club. He's a brilliant player, but he's quite mentally fragile because of a major fail at his old club and some other mental health issues. Jake, in contrast, is the club showman. He is a really fantastic player as well, but he's a bit of a pest, and Theo kind of hates him when he comes to the club. Now, why is that? What's the sort of background to their relationship, I suppose you could call it?
I think something that I've always found interesting is the dynamic that can exist between people when their relationship is probably more about how they see themselves rather than how they see the other person. So I think for Theo, at least, he's someone who is very good at what he does, but the main thing in his way is him. So when he sees Jake, someone who does not suffer from a lack of self-confidence, the sort of person who seems to coast effortlessly through what he's doing on talent, who probably doesn't work as hard as maybe he could because he can coast on talent a little bit, he finds that deeply, deeply annoying. And I think, look, to be honest, I think many of us who perhaps sit on the Theo side of the personality spectrum in terms of suffering from anxiety or imposter syndrome or anything like that, I feel like most people have probably met a Jake in their life and just thought, like, oh, they're just unbearable. But that's more because you look at them and see everything you feel you lack rather than because they themselves are necessarily a terrible person.
Mm. Contrasting characters at the start, but the more they learn about each other, I think the more they realize that they have in common. Now, with your answer there, I think I can probably guess the answer to my next question, which is, which of those characters do you most personally identify with, Jake or Theo?
Absolutely Theo. Theo is much closer to my own personality, and certainly some of his experiences dealing with anxiety were drawn very directly from my own experiences dealing with anxiety, obviously in quite a different professional context. So I'm definitely more like Theo, although that meant that Jake was extremely fun to write because he's nothing like me. And there was something very joyful and playful, I guess, about getting to inhabit this character who is in some ways the opposite of what I'm like. So I had a really good time writing Jake. And then there were also elements of writing Theo, which I think were cathartic in some ways, because I suppose you're writing about some of your own experiences and writing them in a character who is going through overall a really positive and lovely journey.
Interesting. There was a comment on your blog, and you wrote that, as you said, Theo's story is quite personal. As someone who struggled with anxiety for a lot of my adult life, I can empathize with the absolute frustration of being told you can do it and thinking, I know, but I'm not doing it. I find that comment so interesting, and I'm wondering if you can speak a little more to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you are dealing with an anxiety disorder, or I think a lot of mental health things have this in common, and also if you have something like, so I have both ADHD and autism, so that's also a dimension to, I think, writing about a lot of these challenges when you're mainly battling with yourself, because I think a common experience for people who are dealing with mental illness or who are neurodivergent is you want to do something and you know you want to do it, and people will try to encourage you to do it and say you can do it, as though the thing that you're worried about is that you can't do the thing, but you know you can do the thing. It's just bridging the gap between what you're doing now and actually getting your brain to the point where it will allow you to do the thing you want to do. And I think that's quite a difficult experience to describe to people who haven't had the experience of the gap between your desire and even your knowledge that you can do the thing. Because for Theo, like, Theo knows he can play football really well. He's done it in the past. That's why he got drafted. He knows that he has the skills. It's just that he can't work out how to make his way through the internal things that are preventing him from going out there and doing it. And his experience, I think, like lots of people, is that in the end, sometimes it takes getting out of your head. If the problem is sort of in your brain, you can't think your way out of it. It just doesn't work that way. And a few people have messaged me to say that they really related to Theo's experience. And so I hope that for people who have experienced that, it does resonate with them, and I suppose affirm and validate that experience. And perhaps for people who haven't experienced it, it can give them an insight into what it's like when you know you can do the thing, you're not doing it, and that's the problem. It's not a lack of sort of belief in ability, it's the inability to do the thing right now, if that makes sense.
That battle of heart and head, in a way, that the rational part of the brain knows deep down that you can do what you want to do. But thoughts are so powerful, and they have physical ramifications too. I remember, I used to get nervous for piano exams. I knew I could play the pieces, but my fingers would tremble so hard that I just couldn't execute the playing of it. So I think actually most people can relate to that idea of being controlled somewhat by their thoughts. Another thing that I found really interesting in what you've said about the writing of the book is that you initially thought After the Siren would be quite a different book, but then Jake turned up on the page, the uber confident Jake, and you had to discard 40,000 words, which the author in me, that breaks my heart. And you said he, as in Jake, told me in no uncertain terms that I was wrong about a number of things. What were you wrong about? What did you think the book initially was going to be, and how does that differ to what it turned out?
So in its initial formulation, it was probably going to be a little bit darker and angstier. And Jake as a character was not going to be nearly as comfortable with his sexuality and his identity. And so I'd originally envisaged him as a character who hadn't really explored his sexuality, who knew he was queer, but hadn't taken any steps to explore that because he felt like he couldn't. And I was struggling a bit with the narrative. It just wasn't quite coming together. I'm sure you know that feeling when you're like, something is wrong. And a couple of things happened almost at once. And one of them was I started to realize that my initial concept wasn't working with the character I was then writing. And also at the same time, in my non-writing job, I was doing a lot of work on historical hate crimes against the LGBTQ plus community. So my sort of 9 to 5 was very much continually dealing with trauma and violence towards the queer community. And I found that when I was not working, all I wanted was queer joy. I didn't want to write about internalized homophobia or external homophobia or anything. And those two things came together, and Jake really just came to life in my head and sort of said, no, you've been doing this wrong. Of course I explored my sexuality as a teen. In fact, Jake was offended by the suggestion that he would not have done that. And so I think that character really came to life. And in doing so, I discovered to my surprise that I was writing a romantic comedy, not the romance that I'd anticipated. And then after that, there was still some struggles to get it all to work structurally, etc. But once I'd had that realization, I knew what story I was actually writing, and it got a lot easier.
So much joy in this book. And I did have a little happy tear towards the end, which is really unusual for me. But there's a particular scene, and I'm not going to spoil anything, but it did fill me with a lot of hope and happiness, maybe also a tinge of sadness too, because this book doesn't shy away from the realities for queer footy players. As you said, Jake has no issue being gay. He's really happy with himself. His nearest and dearest know his sexuality, but the general public doesn't. And he is conflicted about being closeted, so to speak, as is Theo, but in a slightly different way. His family doesn't know he's bisexual. His very best friend does. What were the challenges of approaching this very relevant topic? Were you worried about sort of making it too joyful and too idealistic, or was that just a core important value for you to retain in this?
It was challenging in some ways, not so much when I was initially writing the story, but then when I came to edit and reflect on it, I started to think a lot about that, because there are a lot of conflicting things that I wanted to deal with, because I think in general, it is a sunnier and more optimistic world in the book than the one we live in. Though it's funny because some people have said to me that it seems almost like hyper positive, whereas to me it felt more like a bit of a twist of the kaleidoscope, I suppose. I didn't want to erase the fact that there would be real obstacles and barriers to players being out. But I also didn't really want to write something bleak or something that focused on those aspects. It was also an interesting book for me to write because in general, I don't think all queer stories should be about coming out. I think there's a real danger in writing a coming out story, especially in this type of context, that suggests that somehow the only courageous thing to do or the best thing to do is to come out, when realistically for people in that kind of scenario, it's completely reasonable to not want to be out. And so I suppose I really wanted to try and balance and engage with the idea that it is in some ways a very fun, joyful story that's a little bit more optimistic than what I think might actually happen in real life. But at the same time, I didn't want to just divorce it completely from what's really going on and the challenges that people would face. So it was tricky to try and strike the balance. And there's a scene where Jake talks to his mum about coming out and what that means. And I wrote that a little bit later because I really wanted to put something in the book that acknowledged that they could come out or they could not come out, and both of those choices would be equally valid, and that there's no obligation on queer people to come out or do things in a particular way. So it was hard balancing those things and wanting to both write a fun and joyful and positive queer story, because there are not enough of those. I mean, I didn't really have any of those when I was a teenager. There are more now, but I wanted to write something where queerness wasn't just a source of trauma or anxiety or negativity. But at the same time, I think that for most queer people, if you move too far away from what it would really be like, it can just start to feel unrealistic and frustrating. So it was a tricky balancing act.
Tricky too, because while the teams in your book are fictional, you're dealing with a real world game. You know, the world of AFL is one that many people are familiar with. We know that there's probably about 700 current AFL men's players. So if you count up current players and former players, there's several thousand AFL players out there. Only one openly bisexual player has ever come out, and that was Mitch Brown, who came out earlier this year, and he was by then retired. And at that around the same time, a current professional player was sanctioned for using a homophobic slur. So in contrast, it's not so much of an issue in the women's league, where there are many openly gay and queer players. And in your book, you do present a really lovely, nuanced argument about the pros and cons, and about this idea that there is no one brave way to live a queer life. But I'm wondering, when you heard about Mitch Brown coming out, what was that like for you to hear that?
It was it was a very strange day, because it was, I think, maybe 3 weeks before the book came out. So a sequence of people messaged me about it, being like, did you plan this? And they're like, no. But it was odd, because it was in some ways really joyful, because it was such a courageous thing for Mitch to do. And I think particularly the couple of weeks beforehand, with everything that had happened with Isaac Rankin using a homophobic slur, had been a really depressing time to be a queer football fan. Not so much because of the individual incident, but I think for me, because of the lack of any meaningful or nuanced discussion around the systemic problems. Because in my view, you don't use that language as an individual unless it's language that is around you. Because, you know, a slur doesn't just pop out in the heat of the moment. It has to be language that is used around you, that you're familiar with. And I think in Isaac Rankin's case, there are also probably complexities of navigating the AFL as an Aboriginal player in a context that is known to have systemic problems with racism at various times. So for me, there was this quite complex, nuanced discussion that could have been had, that could have been a catalyst for change, and that wasn't happening. And there was a lot of very depressing discourse on all sorts of places. I genuinely sometimes think, like, why do I like this game? Why do I want to watch this sport and love it, at least in the men's competition, where a lot of the time it feels like the AFL doesn't care about queer players or queer fans, etc. And so for then Mitch to come out, it was so exciting. But also, I think I've described it a couple of times as being almost like a savage joy, because it felt more like an FU moment than an uncomplicated moment of joy. And I think also because Mitch then talking about his experiences and talking about the fact that his career probably did end early, partly because of the difficulties in that environment, and him talking about some of the experiences he'd had, just made me really sad, because it was clear that, you know, as a queer player, you would have a really, really difficult time navigating that. So I think it was both this great moment of thinking, wow, there's finally someone who has come out and is talking about this, and he's spoken so eloquently about a lot of the issues, including about the Rankin incident. But then at the same time, just a real sense of sadness, because obviously, I think as a matter of statistical probability, there are plenty of players, past and probably current, who would be queer, but none of them are in an environment where that's something that they can say publicly. So it was a mixed bag of feelings, I have to say.
I hear what you're saying. I mean, the AFL and other sports do talk a big game about inclusion, but when you see how few players are willing to just be open and authentic about their sexuality, you do have to question what's going on. But I'm wondering if you can talk more generally about your own personal history with sport, because I gather that you weren't the sportiest of teens, and it's something you've come to a little bit later in life. What sports have you played, and how have they changed your life?
Yeah, I was not a particularly sporty kid or teen. My parents joke that when I learnt to read, I just stopped going outside, because once I could read, what was the point in doing anything except reading? So I was not at all sporty. You know, I gave up PE as soon as I could at school, all of that sort of thing. And then in my late teens, I started to run a little bit just for general fitness. And then in my mid-20s, and this was before I came out as queer, and I did not myself know that I was queer, despite the signs, which in hindsight, you look back and you're like, oh, yeah. But I was in Sydney and I was working and I'd had a long-term relationship end, and I was sort of looking for opportunities to meet people, especially people outside of work. And I sort of thought, oh, I could play a team sport, I guess, but I'd never played team sport. And it was around the time when the AFLW had started, so there was more women's footy, and just part of me thought, I guess I could play footy, because I'd loved footy as a kid, but I'd never played. And so it just appealed to me, I suppose, also because it's always been a bit of a subversive sport to play if you're not a man, in the way that most kind of contact sports or traditionally masculine sports are. So I thought, I'm going to go and play, you know, the lowest possible division of women's AFL. And it was the first time in my life where I'd been in a context where I was kind of just surrounded by queer people, and particularly queer women and non-binary people. And I think that just made some dial shift within me. And over the first few months of being in the team, I was like, oh, okay. Well, actually, really what happened is that I developed such a catastrophic crush on one of my teammates that I was unable to pretend that I was straight anymore. I was like, oh, I really can't pretend that I just admire her football prowess. But so I kept playing AFL, and actually I went overseas for a year and met my wife playing AFL in England for the university we were both at. So it was just this real source of community for me and queerness and inclusion. And so I think that was interesting for me, because on the one hand, for me personally, it had been this really transformative experience of going into a context where the majority of my teammates were queer, and that was in no way a problem. It was almost just assumed from the outset. You sort of have to come out as straight if you wanted to establish that. And so for me, it was this wonderful inclusive space. And then you look at the sort of professional men's competition, and it's the opposite. And I think, talking about my own experiences with sport, I don't play footy anymore because I like my fingers too much and they break too easily. I actually play ice hockey now, a much safer and more sensible sport, obviously. But again, I play for a queer club, and that's been such a source of joy and friendship and support. So I think my personal experiences, I suppose, made me reflect on the different way sporting culture can affect you. And I suppose, what is it about a particular sports culture that makes it safe or not for queer people? And again, because you see in the AFLW, there are a lot of queer players. And if you go to the AFLW, it feels like a very safe and inclusive space. And then you juxtapose that with the AFL. So I think I drew on those experiences, made me interested in some of the things that I talked about in the book, and probably also affected the extent to which I wanted to make sure there was, for example, a presence of AFLW players in the book.
Do you think that the AFL men's comp was going to be the background to your first novel? Obviously, I appreciate that you really loved playing AFL yourself. You have a day job as a barrister too, so it's not like life isn't busy, but you still managed to carve out time to write this book. But yeah, I'm interested in that point where you sit down and you think, okay, I'm going to write a book. What's it going to be about? Why did you decide on this particular topic?
So probably a mix of different things. I've always read a lot of queer romance. Writing queer romance myself, I tend to write about cisgender men, partly just because I'm non-binary, and I sometimes find that that is a safe space from any body dysphoria. So it's like a safe escapist space for me. And then I was reading a lot of queer ice hockey romance at the time, because I love a sports romance and I've always enjoyed a hockey romance. It's actually why I started playing ice hockey. I read too many of them and was like, this seems like a good idea. But there was no AFL romance. And I really, really wanted one because I love my footy. And so I just got to the point where I was like, well, I guess I'm going to have to write it. It's funny because it's the first novel I've ever finished. I've always had lots of ideas and done lots of writing, but I'd never seen one through. And I think maybe it was just the first time where I thought, no, I'm actually just going to do it. And perhaps also because I think in romance, indie publishing has become such a prominent part of the romance genre. It suddenly felt like, well, if I write a good book that I think is good, doesn't matter whether a traditional publisher wants it. I could just indie publish it and maybe only 10 people think it's great. But for those 10 people, they really love it. And so it just suddenly, I think everything came together and I just had a moment of thinking like, well, why don't I do it? And off I went.
That is the beauty of deciding to go down an indie route, that you can really lean into a niche because you know that there's going to be at least someone out there who's going to read and appreciate it. But traditional publishers have very set algorithms and volumes on how many people they want you to appeal to. But what's so interesting about your journey is that it sounds like you're on the verge of hitting print on your book to be self-published when you got an email out of the blue. Can you tell me that story?
When I finished the book, I sort of thought, oh, maybe I should try traditional publishing first. So I did my research and I was querying US agents, and I did submit it to a Penguin open call for submissions. And, you know, as you would know, and I'm sure many listeners do, if you're submitting to a big publishing house, they'll just tell you, if you don't hear from us within 6 months, we don't want it. And I had this moment because, you know, I was working full time and I was finding that all of the time I had to write, I was spending querying and writing a synopsis in 2 pages, 4 pages, 10 pages, and different query letters and different bios and all of that. And I suddenly thought, I just had this moment, it was like, I hate this so much. It's not worth it. And I had a friend who very recently indie published a book, and I had coffee with him and sort of said, like, what did you do? How did you do it? And because I was working full time as well, it's like, I can pay for an editor, I can pay for cover art. So I just thought, you know what, screw it. I'm doing this myself. I can't deal with the lack of control and the lack of certainty and just waiting endlessly. And part of me also thought, you know, a traditional publisher is not going to want my queer AFL romance. It's just too niche. So I went down that path and got it edited and got a typesetter. And we were literally the day when I was going to tell him that we were good to go and that we could print. I can't remember, I wasn't printing that many copies, but, you know, because I imagined I would be posting them from my garage. And then on that day, I got an email from Chris Ebbs at Penguin sort of saying, hello, you submitted your manuscript back in January. It was also, I had it marked in my diary, it was the day before the 6-month point. So right at the cutoff. And Chris had actually seen some of the advertising I'd done on social media because I was promoting the book and myself and that sort of thing. And so she'd seen that and gotten the manuscript to the sort of first 50 pages had come across her desk. And so she emailed to ask if I was still interested in traditional publishing, which was, again, a very exciting but also very strange email to get. And from that point onwards, and I was still interested in traditional publishing, though I have to say, in some ways it was this dream email where I was like, wow, I can't believe Penguin are interested in my book. But then there was also this part of it, it was like, I was about to do it. I'd nearly just done it. You know, I had a release date. It was all ready to go. But there were various back and forths. And in the midst of it all, I got an agent and that sort of thing. But within a couple of months, I think it was a shorter time than that, it's a bit of a blur now. I look back, I'm like, how long did it take? But Penguin wanted to acquire it, which was very unexpected and amazing, obviously. But yeah, it was a very odd journey from indie publishing to suddenly Penguin is publishing it, which still feels a little bit surreal, I have to say.
Quite an unusual story, but do you think at the end of the day that it was the right way for you to go? And can you also just talk a little bit about the cover, which you had a cover designed. It's beautiful. It's an illustration of our two main characters. They're wearing their footy gear. They're slightly turned away from each other, but their fingertips are nearly brushing, which is very hot. And there's also a beautiful rainbow boundary line, which reflects the fact that it is a sports book, and you got to basically keep that cover. So I guess my question is twofold. Was trad publishing right for you, and how delighted were you that you got to keep your self-publishing cover?
I was so delighted to answer the second part first, because something that does really bug me with romance novels is when the cover is not right. It's just always really irked me. And so one of the things that I felt really good about indie publishing was I was like, I have complete control. And so I worked with a really great illustrator and artist, Jess Cruikshank, and she did this gorgeous cover. We sort of worked through various different options and stuff, but I always wanted the rainbow boundary line. And then there was just a random photo of a couple of players at a training, and they were standing in a very similar way, although they were actually touching, because they were doing the thing you do in footy where you like keep an eye on your opponent by like having a hand on them somehow while you're looking away at something else. And it was just something about the pose, and the other player was doing the same thing, like also looking away, but you're just keeping an eye on them. And I really liked that image. It felt like such a footy image. And then I was like, can we just move them apart so their hands are like nearly touching? And there's just that like aching distance between the fingers. But to go back to the first part, I think traditional publishing has been awesome. I'm not sure whether I can say it was right, because I don't know what the counterfactual would have been. But I think there were massive advantages to it in terms of distribution and in terms of, I suppose, the level of support and the additional channels you get for promotion and all of that, which have been wonderful. And the team of people I worked with at Penguin have been amazing. I did wonder whether they would ask me to tone any of it down, because for a genre romance novel, it's not that explicit, but by mainstream fiction standards, it's very explicit. So I find mileage varies in terms of readers thinking that either it's a totally like normal amount of smut versus it's the smuttiest thing they have ever read in their life, which is quite funny. But I wondered whether they would ask me to adjust it to make it more palatable to a broader audience, I suppose, which I would have had hesitations about doing, but they did not. And I was really grateful for that, and not surprised, but I just wondered about whether I would get told maybe it's a little bit too queer. But no, there was nothing but sort of complete support. And also I got to use the rainbow penguin logo, which was completely delightful. It's actually the first book that we know of in the world, definitely in Australia, with the rainbow penguin, which I absolutely love.
I love that you had a publisher who was so fully on board. And I'm also really glad that they didn't tinker too much with the sex scenes, because the feedback that I've seen and that I personally felt is that the intimacy scenes, they're really hot, but they're really well done. And it's very easy to get intimate scenes terribly badly wrong. But the ones that you write, they're very masculine, but they're also very tender. I'm wondering, what were your guiding lights or principles for approaching those scenes?
I tend to start with what works between the characters, and I guess as a romance author you tend to be writing what you find hot, because you wouldn't be writing it if you didn't. And I think also for me, those types of scenes are just so important to the growth of the relationship between the characters. And for me, writing intimate scenes, I sometimes joke that something always goes wrong in many of the intimate scenes I write. But I think that's because I feel like being in that context can be such an interesting way for people to have to experience vulnerability. And sometimes it's somewhere where you find out something surprising about someone, because, you know, someone who's very confident is suddenly much less confident in that context, or someone who seemed uncaring or standoffish responds really compassionately to something that goes wrong. And also because I think inherently intimacy, while often very sexy, can also be quite silly and it can be a bit ridiculous. And I just enjoy having that space to explore character. And I think also as a romance author, there's no right way to approach sex scenes or anything like that. But I do sometimes reflect on scenes that I read when I was first reading romance novels and the way that they portrayed consent and intimacy, and I suppose what is sexy. And so I feel like when I write, I do think about what am I saying about what is hot when I write these scenes. And I'm not suggesting that sort of everyone has a responsibility to do that, but I've had a couple of people talk to me about how sort of consent forward the sex scenes are, because I had someone else say, like, you just can't write a sex scene without there being so much talking in it. I was like, well, yeah, but you have to talk.
I actually thought it was very realistic, not a lot of complete sentences in the heat of the moment, but some complete sentences where, consent, for example, was required and clear communication was necessary.
It's interesting because I feel like when I was reading a lot of romance in my sort of teens, there was this idea that the sexiest thing that could be happening would be your partner just somehow intuiting everything that you wanted without you ever saying anything or them ever asking anything. I did think that was sexy when I was reading them, because that's what you read and you think, oh, wouldn't it be amazing if this person just knew? And I suppose in some ways, yes, but at the same time, now I think no, because you can't just do it. And in retrospect, it's fine because, in fact, that was what the person was into. So I think I do reflect on that, and I think about what I now find sexy, and I suppose what I want readers to find sexy. And maybe for some people, it's surprising because they're like, oh, I wouldn't have thought that I would enjoy a book with this much talking, but here we go. There's a scene where Jake and Theo are kissing, and then Jake realizes Theo is quite drunk and calls a halt. And it's been interesting because a couple of people have said to me how much they enjoyed that as a scene, just the fact that Jake had stopped and been like, no. And so for me, as an author writing those scenes, I feel like I'm always thinking about what works for the characters and what is sexy. But there is also a voice in my head that's like, what are you saying to readers about intimacy and about what is sexy and about what makes a relationship a positive one?
Yeah, I think the idea that your partner's just going to be an awesome mind reader is the route to disappointed expectations somehow. But just talking more generally about writing, you do have a busy and demanding day job. There are lots of writers or aspiring authors out there who I think we all struggle sometimes to fit writing into our daily routines. What would your advice be to them? What's worked for you?
The key thing has just been being realistic about what I can actually achieve and working out what works for my brain, because I've always seen a lot of advice that says, you have to write every day, or, write this much every day and all of that sort of stuff. And I think for some people that works really well. But for me, it was mainly about sitting down and sort of saying, realistically, where can I write and how much do I think I can? Because I think the problem that I have is if you set a really aspirational goal and then you start not hitting it, that almost becomes a disincentive, because you're like, well, what's the point? I didn't write my 1,000 words yesterday. So I certainly haven't worked out really how to do it. But I think just being realistic about what I could and couldn't achieve, and also accepting that for me, there are times when I write really consistently every day, and then there are times where I don't write for a couple of weeks. Actually, it's funny, until the 2 weeks before the weekend, I just could not write. My brain, I was looking at the manuscript, I was, tapping away, tinkering with words, just couldn't do it. And then over the weekend, I think I wrote about 5,500 words, just because suddenly something clicked in my brain, and I feel like I will write quite a lot over the next couple of weeks. So I think being realistic about what you can achieve and not beating yourself up that it's hard, because it is hard, to do both, and it's tiring, and sometimes it sucks trying to get it all done. And in the end, it doesn't matter if it takes a long time. And it doesn't matter if sometimes other stuff has to take priority. You've just got to sort of keeping on as best you can, and you'll get it done.
The exciting part about that answer is that you're clearly working on something new, and I did read a little rumor that it might be a sequel to After the Siren. Is that what's happening?
I have written the sequel. I'm working on the third book very optimistically. So I have written a sequel. It will just be a matter of whether or not Penguin want to acquire it. But it's not about Jake and Theo. It's about one of the secondary characters from After the Siren.
Paddy or Zeno? Or...
Everyone wants it to be Paddy. It's actually about Alex, the captain, which is it's a surprise option in many respects. And I have to say, it was very fun to write, and I love the story very much because they're both a bit older, like closer to my age than Jake and Theo, and it's in some ways it is a gentler and more domestic romance. So I have my fingers crossed at the moment that I will get to put it out into the world.
I'm here for that. I might have to lobby Penguin for them to buy it and put it out. Anyway, Darcy, we've come to the end of our time together today, but I just want to thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your insight, and for writing a truly fantastic book that I think, for young and old people of all sexual persuasions, interests, is really interesting. It's topical, it's joyful. As I said, I cried, I laughed, I just had a ball with it. So thank you and congratulations.
Thank you very much for having me and for this really lovely chat.
That's it for this episode, folks. Hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If so, I'd love it if you'd leave a review on your preferred listening platform, which may include Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Until next time, friends, happy reading.